I think all of the product alpha is likely in context engineering, especially as the UI disappears into the model. What's going to be left is just better context engineering, how to inject the context at the right place at the right time with the highest amount of accuracy and determinism and precision. That's going to be how folks win. And I think one must have very good research DNA and very good service DNA to really win in the battle of enterprise agents. Welcome to episode 13 of Agentic Data, podcast about the intersection between data and AI. My name is Joseph Moon, CEO of Oxygen Intelligence. And today, let's just talk about some research topics in AI and some observations that folks are making about the space. The first topic that I want to talk to you about is this notion of UI is pre-AI. Let's take a look here. I came across this post on X of Naval Ravikant saying UI is pre-AI. In typical Naval fashion, he's tweeting or zeeting in a fortune cookie-like style without any other explanation. But this other person, Shiamal, is really unraveling this concept. And I think this unraveling was one of my favorite repostings that I've seen on X. So let me read it out loud here. Few will understand this. For the last few decades, UI UX has been built on a stable background assumption. The human is the only general intelligence in the loop. Software is procedural. UI's job is to make that procedure discoverable and efficient, show the state of the system, expose available operations, help users compose operations into workflows. The questions then are the following. How do we reduce cognitive load? How do we make navigation and affordances clear? How do we get from novice to expert performance within a fixed interaction grammar? This assumption breaks when the system can interpret language, infer goals, propose plans, and adapt across tasks. A lot of today's UI patterns will feel as strange as command lines do to a 10-year-old. I think this is a pretty astute observation here. And I think we discussed this with Robert in the earlier episodes of Agentic Data. I think the observation was, as humans, we are fundamentally rate limited by our sensory input. Namely, we sense things with our eyes, with our ears, with our nose, with our mouths, with our touch, etc. But generally speaking, when we're interacting with software systems, we're using a keyboard, a mouse to really navigate the screen. The screen is like a 2D fixture that we're navigating information through. And then we're using our eyes to look at a flat screen. And then the screen shows abstract representations of data to your eyes. And then we take that input and then we perform actions with our hands using keyboards and mice to control the computer. And the GUI is center stage, so graphical user interface. There is this refactoring of everything into language so that you could speak directly to a computer, which in itself is efficient from an intent perspective, like I want to do this perspective. But of course, language is also very brittle and lacks context. And so prompting requires context engineering precisely because language is so imprecise, where computer code is pretty precise, but not a lot of people could get to that precision, whereas language has extremely high recall and high availability to every single person on the earth. But it requires precision, so that this is why it requires context engineering. And it is true that AI systems don't have the same bottlenecks that humans do in terms of the bit rate to its brain, so to speak. So it could process vast amounts of information instantaneously. It could really fit a lot of information in its context window. It doesn't really have to just look at things visually or through text or JSONs. It could understand things in a multimodal fashion, just like humans do, but in a super high throughput way. So even though right now machines have high throughput but low intelligence, we will soon enter into a world where machines have high throughput and high intelligence. And when that happens, I think fundamentally software will have to change so that the primary users of software, what we call software, is going to be agents and not humans. And we talked about this. We gave a distinction before. We said that agentic software, so headless agentic software is going to be used by agents. So there should be software used by agents, namely APIs and MCP endpoints and so forth. This is likely built for agents without a head, without an interface, without a GUI interface. So the world is going to look like a bunch of API endpoints for agents, and then GUI is going to be really restricted for humans. And I think there's going to be a big refactor here where, your enterprise software darlings like Salesforce, Workday, etc., ServiceNow, a lot of GUI components in there, a lot of complexity on making GUI the primary entry point into everything, and also making a lot of complex GUI operations possible to build a lot of different procedures on the platform, on the software, on the piece of software. This is also true for data systems and BI systems, where BI systems like Tableau and Looker made it really easy for analysts to whip up dashboards and share them and so forth. And I think in this brave new world of agents, that behavior is likely going to go away in favor of agents being the primary citizen. I think that's why one of the reasons why we call this podcast Agentic Data is because we want agents to have primacy in this brave new world. So people talk about enterprise software as having a great business model, but I think we're going to be soon talking about enterprise agents as the entire category of companies that are built. Of course, agents still need a system of record. A system of record is most importantly a database of information. So maybe ironically, what's going to happen is the app layer is probably going to be absorbed into more and more into the model layer as the model eats more and more of the sort of the GUI-less workflow automation pieces. And then infra will stay infra because you still need stable infra to just put your data and host your data. So I think we're going to probably be seeing this shrinking of the middle, this application layer, and really go into a world where the databases matter and then the agents matter. And like we talked about maybe last episode or the 2 episodes before, the reason why system of record companies are very powerful is because it has a data lock-in through the database aspect of the system of record. Salesforce is notoriously not the best platform to use from a usability perspective, but it has so many integrations and it's effectively operating like a Postgres database for your sales information. So that lock-in is huge, the gravity is huge. Workday, I've never seen any person like using Workday, but it's just covers a massive surface area and just does everything that you want to do. We are on Rippling. Nobody says that using Rippling is a delightful experience from the UI UX perspective, but it just does a lot of things. So we love using Rippling for that perspective because it just automates a lot of operational tasks. So we're not using it for the beauty of the UI UX or the feeling that you get. You're just using it because it's very convenient and it serves as a system of record for employee data. That was a thesis behind Parker's memos on building Rippling. So I think the system of record companies will start to look more like database companies, and then you're going to have agents running on top of them. Some companies will have the system of record bundled in with the agents. Some companies will be agents first, and both plays will likely be good plays. But some large companies will form where these large companies are agents only. And if we learn anything from technology, the separation of concerns, this is a very powerful idea. In the mainframe computer days, hardware was coupled with software until pure play software companies like Microsoft came along and said, hey, this operating system could be used on just any type of hardware. That was revolutionary. And the decoupling from hardware to software really happened. And on the server side, with the introduction of things like Linux servers, then the separation between the hardware piece and then the Linux servers, the software piece of the operating system kind of emerged. And then even within software itself, the decoupling between the databases or the data warehouses from the application layer software, that has happened. And if history repeats the past and rhymes with the past, and of course, this uncoupling between agents and software is going to happen. The agents and the system of record, this is bound to happen. There's a lot of economic forces driving this behavior, and there's a lot of logical reasons to drive this behavior. And like one of the logical reasons is in adoption, there are a lot of advantages for having this uncoupling happen, because the closer you are to the application layer, the more you want a decoupling between the base infrastructure system and the application layer, because you want to be able to use the infrastructure that you want. And oftentimes you're using like more like legacy infrastructure, and that you want to be able to put in the application layer. And I think I've been reading this book on Oracle software recently, and it really describes Oracle's journey in transitioning from more like an database infrastructure provider into going into the application market. And it's very clear, even from those days, in the early 90s, The application business is a very different business than the infrastructure business in the sense that the application business is much, much closer to how the business operates on the customer side. True understanding of how the business runs and how the function runs is very important. Whereas the infrastructure, as an infrastructure provider, you you know you build things with great precision and with great engineering, and you give it to the customer, and the customer just runs it, and that's call it a day. I mean, I'm being reductive here, but that's kind of how Larry Ellison describes it. And so, even from that perspective, if the agents are closer to the business and the system of record is actually becomes more like a database type of situation, then that separation will happen. So, I think this unpacking this Naval quote is quite fun and quite predictive of the future. Okay, let's move on to the next topic here. I want to talk about moats. I think as I was preparing for some conversations in the past 2 weeks, I have stumbled across this type of insight that I just synthesized. It sounds very obvious, and it is obvious when you say it, but I just want to make it explicit. And this is the idea of enterprise moats in this brave new world of agents. I think from my perspective, I think things in the agentic stack are becoming very rapidly commoditized. So models are rapidly commoditizing, especially with open source movements. And while the capex is huge on having the latest and best models, only a few companies could do that. And generally speaking, models are becoming just good enough for a lot of different tasks. So good enough open source models will continue to flourish, I think. Software, because you could vibe code a lot of software now, software is rapidly commoditizing. And from a distribution standpoint, because content marketing is rapidly commoditizing, because you could just spin up podcasts like this, you could create content through AI, you could create music, you could generate audio and video and things like that with AI. Content marketing also rapidly commoditizing. And I think the only enduring enterprise moats are going to be research and customer service. Customer service in terms of having better support, white glove support, and building end-to-end solutions. And this is why companies like Accenture, Deloitte, PwC, all these integration companies, these technology consulting companies are doing so well, generating billions and billions of dollars service fees right now, because that kind of service is definitely needed by the companies. And a lot of software companies traditionally, they just don't want to get into this services territory. So, but services is quite key. And I think especially in data companies, like data infrastructure companies that really are ripping out old infrastructure and putting in new infrastructure. A lot of migration services are definitely necessary, and that should be part of the experience of the customer. If you believe in more like a Tesla model of delivery, where Tesla owns all of the end centers, the end distribution centers directly to the customer, like the retail centers, they don't go through car dealerships. Tesla's has their own car dealerships. That experience is a lot more controlled and it's much better for the end user. And from a research perspective, I think it's quite clear that higher precision enterprise workflows have to have really good context engineering baked in. And we talked about the evolution of prompt engineering into context engineering. This has happened. This is entering into the vernacular. And from that perspective, we need a system for better context engineering. And a lot of that is domain specific, like depending on what process you're trying to automate. To give you a very reductive example, of course, the context engineering of how to interact with like a full self-driving car is going to be very vastly different from robots and vastly different from like enterprise workflows in data and customer service and marketing. All these things are going to be quite different, maybe with the same core, but the end, sort of the last mile, is going to be quite different. So context engineering for that is going to be vastly different. And I think all of the product alpha is likely in context engineering, especially as UI really disappears into the model, as we talked about a few minutes ago. As the UI disappears into the model, what's going to be left is just better context engineering and how to inject the context at the right place at the right time with the highest amount of accuracy and determinism and precision. That's going to be how folks win. And I think one must have very good research DNA and very good service DNA to really win in the battle of enterprise agents. And I think a lot of folks are missing out on that. I think in the early innings, which is right now, early innings, better software building is going to work because still software is not trivial to make and to distribute. So for the next like 5 years or so, probably software is going to have some value. But in 10 years, most likely the software vendors will have to really stand its ground and become consolidated to hold its ground. And software as a as an object will start to become this legacy object most likely. And from that perspective, another thing that we could think of is the operating system itself is a lot of software. And perhaps what's scary to think about is like the model companies like OpenAI and Anthropic taking over the OS layer by like computer use and so forth. So like the agent layer, the demand layer, the agent layer becomes basically the operating system in which you operate your entire life. And you have this decoupling between the OS layer and agent OS layer, but then the agent OS layer starts to have more primacy because it's much closer to the user intent. Just like how the separation between infrastructure and apps and agents, maybe there's going to be a separation between the base OS layer and like the agent layer, the agent OS layer. That's pretty frightening to think about because the fundamental paradigm of operating systems might change, and this might be bad news for Apple and Microsoft. But in any case, I think the companies that are going to win are the companies with the research DNA and the service DNA. But I think what we're seeing is that software people are definitely not agents people. And so we need folks that are agents first and not software first. And that's going to be a very rude awakening for people who have built their entire careers on software and now are forced to either adapt to the agents world or just or sort of fall off and be caught up in this discontinuity in the marketplace. And I think the fundamental shift is from determinism. So things like deterministic distributed systems as like a complex system that one could make into distributed probabilistic system of agents. And that requires a good understanding of probability and randomness and handling that randomness, especially through evals and testing and observability. But I think there has to be enterprise-wide change in the way that we fundamentally think about agents versus software. And we need to get prepared for a world where almost everything is run by agents and not software. And that is something that we are not currently equipped to really fully comprehend in terms of the consequences. And so instead of software engineers, I think what's going to be more valuable in the future is likely going to be knowing how to be an agent engineer. And this is likely going to be a new job category that we're going to have to invent together. So there you have it, folks. So these two research points, one about the collapsing of the UI into the model, and UI is pre-AI, and most things will probably be agents. And the UI is sort of this intermediate step that we had to go through before the invention of agents. And then secondly, in terms of the moats, if you're building in an enterprise setting, and a lot of people are, most folks are actually building for the enterprise, then one must really focus on differentiated research and differentiated customer service. And also, if you're in a position to evaluate vendors, I think you have to evaluate software vendors and agent vendors differently. Agent vendors should be about research and service. Software vendors really about the software and sort of the how to integrate that neatly into an organization. But agent vendors should be focused on research and service. Okay, see you next time on Agentic Data.